Good everyone, it is Vinny, and today we have a Should You Talisman episode on the M2 medium tank. This, of course, is going after the LVT, and I already said that this thing is not very good. And yeah, this is probably going to just be a roasting of this tank, but we'll see, won't we? So in the description below, as per normal, there's going to be a few timestamps. You can skip ahead to the armor/weaponry of the tank. You can skip ahead to when we go and take it for a little drive, just to see how it does, and also show off the gun handling. And then, of course, we come to back to the hangar for the competition of the tank, which there's a lot, spoiler alert. And finally, the conclusion, which, spoiler alert, not going to be a good one, but, well, you knew that if you've ever played this tank. So let's get in and start out with the weaponry. And of course, the armor. We're going to start out with the armor first, as per normal. The armor on this tank is theoretically not too shabby. If we look at the front plate, it's 28.5mm thick. And this upper part here is a bit sloped, which is useful. It bounces some of the lower caliber AP rounds. But of course, it does normalise as you get towards the bottom, but that's where the transmission can potentially eat a shot. The problem is, no one with the, shall we say, the ones who are gifted with the slightest bit of intelligence will just shoot your driver's hatch, which is extremely large. Let's also not forget, if you angle this tank, you will also normalise pretty much these blisters on the side. But we'll get to these blisters in a moment because they are what make this tank a bit special. So obviously the side of the tank is 28.4mm, and it's at 28 then. And that's okay. Like, it's pretty reasonable. Coming around to the rear, we do have 25.4, and of course a little bit of 9.5 down here, which of course is a weak spot for the engine. So if you are struggling to kill this tank from behind for whatever reason, you can just shoot down here and shoot the engine out pretty easily. And of course, when we come to the turret is the best selling point about this vehicle. That's because of the sloping. So as you can see here, the slope angle is pretty good, and giving it effective thickness of around 60mm. Combine that with a double overlapped gun mantlet, this tank can take some beating hold down, and it's obviously pretty well armoured in that regard. And with only one crew member up here, it can easily take a lot of shots to bring this thing down, as it's a 6-man vehicle. But of course, there is going to be some downsides to this. And we'll start out with, of course, well, not the gun, because the gun is actually good. It's the same 37mm you should be pretty familiar with at this point in the US tech tree. And this is, of course, the main selling part. It's got a decent gun. But unfortunately, that's where it all goes to shit. If we take a look at the turret traverse of the vehicle, it is 4.7 degrees a second. Now, on a stock crew, unspaded vehicle, that is 3.3 degrees a second. That makes an M10 blush. Now, we do get decent gun depression at 10 degrees. Obviously, it's quite a tall tank. And the reload rate is also pretty solid. But the turret traverse just really kills it, and obviously the reactionary mobility due to its size isn't the greatest. And now you may have noticed in the X-ray there's a lot of machine guns sticking out this thing. Yeah, those all work apart from these two on the turret, but I'm suspecting they're spares or something. And that means you have a lot of 30 caliber machine guns. You have 2 fixed forward firing for the driver to use. You've got 1 each for the blister guns. And then, of course, you've got the coaxial 30 caliber machine gun up here. Now, if only we could make one of these 2 up here become a roof-mounted machine gun, and this thing could probably just be a rolling 30 cal pillbox. But, well, I say pillbox. It's not a very effective pillbox, but you get my point. But when we come around to the mobility, we have 350 horsepower propelling the 17.2 ton tank to a top speed of 34 miles per hour. Now, it's not as fast as the Stuarts, if anyone's thinking it is. It's not. It does get up to similar speeds off-road, but otherwise, it's not going to be keeping up with them all the time. And of course, being quite a tall vehicle, it does make it quite easy to shoot and destroy, especially if you're targeting the blisters, because These are obviously quite a bit weaker than the actual armor itself. So overall, it's not looking too good on the armor front. Its mobility is solid, and the gun is solid. The hold down protection is also pretty good, so long as you can protect this part of the tank. So it's not all bad, but maybe it drives well. So on that note, let's go into the test drive and take a little drive in it. See you shortly. And welcome to the test drive. One thing I need to point out is the amount of ammunition this tank carries. As you can see down in the ammunition, I couldn't be bothered to change it. I'm carrying 95 rounds of ammunition. This tank can carry up to 200. Don't do that. I mean, you're not going to get ammo right because no one really shoots down there, but that's not my point. You don't need 200 rounds. Alright, let's go for a little drive. So as you can see, the blister guns all move independently. I think you can manually take control of them, like you can leave the 37 to do its own thing, like you can lock it in place, and then you can like move the machine gun blisters and everything. You technically have quite good coverage with the 30 cals, but of course there are some parts where it can't shoot, where the 30 cal coax would have to do it, such as over the side of the vehicle like this. But otherwise, it's pretty well covered in 30 cals. Like, if you're dealing with a lot of light targets, it's certainly acceptable. But in terms of its driving, it's not too bad. It's a little bit slow, as you can tell, to get going, but once it gets going, it does get up to a decent speed. And even off-road, it can drive pretty nicely. Of course, you saw there it started to tip a little bit. It is very top-heavy, as to be expected. But off-road performance is pretty good. Like, you're not going to be keeping up with the light tanks too easily, but it's not too bad. But as I said, the gun handling, not really this vehicle's strong suit. Of course, when you penetrate, the gun is the same as the 37s you've been using up to this point. Pretty solid. But yeah. If you can get the tank into a position like this, so you can shoot at enemy tanks, you're going to be in a pretty good position, because then you've got your gun mantlet facing the enemy. Obviously, you'd be a bit further back, like maybe here-ish. So then you're only really exposing the turret front. And overall, it can definitely get some stuff done if you manage to get it into this sort of position. But as I said, it's reactionary mobility. In fact, I'll put the tank in neutral and then I can demonstrate. So let's say, in fact, for example, let's say that truck over there is coming to engage us and we're engaging this Panzer II. So let's say we've killed the Panzer II, just like that, and then we spot the truck. Now that might seem fast, but remember this thing has only 25mm of side armor, which, as I said, if you angle it, it normalizes. That truck would have more than enough time to either cripple us or kill us by the time we can react. The way to get around this is to drive the tank forward and then steer. But as you can see, the gun can't keep up, making this a bit awkward. And of course the reverse gear is adequate, but generally speaking, it's not good enough. But yeah, it drives well. It's just a little bit slow on the reactionary part, and of course the turret reverse really does let it down. But of course, the gun itself, perfectly adequate. Alright, let's head back to the hangar and let's assess this vehicle's competition, and then of course, come to the conclusion. See you shortly. And welcome back to the hangar. Once again, I'm going to be repeating myself from the stewards, really. But what choice do I really have? I mean, would you really want to talisman this thing? Like, yeah, it does have some benefits, and if you get around the fact that it's not very good if you leave it in first gear and you don't drive forward from a neutral position, it can react to some extent, but as I said, the turret generally can't keep up, and that just really limits it. As I said, if you go to the gunner and max out your targeting speed, you're looking at 5.5 degrees a second. That's slower than a lot of tank destroyers and a lot of other light and medium tanks are going to be running into. That's just not acceptable. And of course, if you compare it to the Stuart, it's nearly 3 times faster. And heck, on my current crew, it's around about 4 times faster almost. Obviously, the Stuart is on a base crew at the minute, so if I was to put it, let's say, here, you can see the turret traverse is nearly 5 times faster, and this isn't on my best crew. The simple fact is, the Stuarts can react a lot easier than this thing can. Going back to that though, the LVT, even though I kind of shitted on this tank a little bit, it's still a better choice than the M2. Obviously, the LVT does have its fair share of flaws, but it's perfectly solid. And even vehicles like the M22. This thing is small, it's fast, it's got pretty decent turret traverse, and, well, it trades survivability because obviously it doesn't have 6 crew. I'd be a bit worried if there was 6 crew crammed in this poor thing. But it not only gets the same 37mm, but it also is a lot smaller, easy to conceal, easier to drive, a lot more better in the driving department, etc. Then, of course, you come to the Stuarts, which really need no introduction. And, of course, the 75mm M8 HMC. Whilst this isn't the most forgiving to people, and obviously it has a pretty equivalent turret traverse to the M2, I've had a blast with the M8 HMC, both it in the US tech tree and the Chinese tech tree. There's really nothing wrong with this thing, and yeah, it's open top, but I mean, you've got a 50 cal at 1.3. What do you really need to say? And heck, if you really want to go balls deep, you can go for the 75mm M3 GMC, which, yeah, it's a bit easy to kill these days because a lot of people just cast you to death, but it's pretty solid and packs a decent punch. And unfortunately, that does bring us to the conclusion. In conclusion, do not talisman this tank. It does obviously have some benefits over the tech tree tanks. Like I said, if you hold down with the turret front facing them, it is quite hard to penetrate. But there are parts which people can shoot, and obviously they can disable your breach because there's only one part that's actually protecting it at one point, which is 10mm thick. So if they do hit that, which is quite a hard shot, but they can hit it, generally you're not going to end up well. And as I said, one shot from a Panzer IV 7 or Panzer IV, I think they said Panzer IV 7 in that proves to be ours I've been playing lately. But for a perfect example, a 75mm armor piercing round from a Panzer IV-C, even on a indirect shot towards the crew, would pretty much kill the tank, as you can see here. So the extra crews, and there you go, it's just wiped out the crew, and it's not even penetrating through the driver's hatch, which it very easily can do. And, well, there goes your extra survivability. So yeah, in conclusion, I would not recommend Talisman in this tank. It's just not that good. It's not slow by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just not ideal. If you're an experienced player who likes something that's hold down capable, yeah, at a stretch you could probably Talisman this thing. But otherwise, I would just leave this thing aside. Next up in the series, of course, is going to be the M8 HMC, which, of course, we've not long talked about. And well, obviously, I've been praising it a little bit. But of course, it has had a nerf recently, which you can see there. So it does obviously trade a little bit, but it did also get a bit of a buff, so to speak, in some parts of it. So I'll cover that more in detail because obviously the M8 HMC has not long had this change, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Anywho, I'll leave you all to it for today. I hope you enjoyed seeing the M2 Medium get its Should You Talisman episode, and I will see you all on the next one.